Karoline Leavitt walked through the towering doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. This time, she wasn't just walking into any courtroom. Today, she would face a confrontation that would test her very right to be there. She kept her composure, but inside the pressure built. She had been through courtrooms before, but never like this. Today, she wasn't the defendant or an observer. She was a witness, with a responsibility that far outweighed any of the nervous jitters she had come to expect. She moved past the grand marble pillars and into the bustling hallways, the air thick with the murmur of voices and the shuffle of papers. The usual courthouse atmosphere surrounded her. A clerk behind a desk, officers maintaining the order of things, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing off the stone floors. She noticed the looks, eyes scanning her, judging her based on nothing but her appearance. But today there was something different. Today, her presence felt heavier, more deliberate. She wasn't just here for the routine of a court case. She was about to challenge something much bigger than herself. As she neared the courtroom door, a figure blocked her path. Officer Trent Malloy, in his mid-30s, stood before her with his arms crossed, his uniform gleaming in the dim light. His badge was a stark contrast against his cold demeanor, but it was his eyes that really caught her attention, dark, calculating, and full of judgment. Karoline couldn't help but notice the coldness in his gaze. It wasn't just about her appearance. It was something deeper, personal. She had heard rumors about Malloy, rumors of a man with a history of questionable decisions, one whose pride had been wounded by a woman's testimony in a previous trial, a case he had never quite gotten over. Karoline had heard the whispers. Malloy resented being bested by a woman in the courtroom. "You sure you're in the right place?" His voice wasn't curious. It was dismissive, as if questioning whether she had any right to be there at all. Karoline met his gaze with steady calm, gripping the folder she held a little tighter. "Yes, I'm here to testify in the Leavitt case. These documents are for the court." Malloy didn't move to take the folder from her. Instead, he scanned her from head to toe, his gaze lingering longer than necessary, assessing her, questioning whether she truly belonged. "Just you? No attorney with you?" His tone turned colder, almost mocking, as if the very idea of her standing alone was laughable. "I'm a witness, not a party to the case," Karoline replied, her voice unwavering. "I wasn't asked to bring an attorney." Malloy's lips curled into a short, humorless laugh. "Right. Witnesses don't usually look like they're here to negotiate a plea deal." Karoline ignored the jab, maintaining her composed posture. "I just need to deliver these to the clerk before the hearing begins." Without a word, Malloy stepped forward, completely blocking her path. "You can leave it with me. I'll make sure it gets where it needs to go." It was the classic move, a subtle assertion of power, an attempt to undermine her autonomy. Karoline wasn't fooled, though. She wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, and this wasn't the moment she would let someone else decide her fate. With a slow, measured breath, she spoke again, her voice calm, yet unyielding. "With all due respect, officer, these are government-certified documents. I was instructed to deliver them in person." Malloy tilted his head, his posture growing more imposing. "You say that like it means something?" "It does," Karoline replied firmly. He took another step closer, his eyes darkening, the space between them closing. "You want people to take you seriously? Maybe try showing up looking like you belong in a courthouse." The words hit harder than she expected, but Karoline didn't flinch. She stood tall, steady, her resolve unbroken. "I've served in this system before," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I know what it means to stand in a place where the stakes are higher than just your pride." Malloy's smile faltered for a split second, his eyes narrowing further as he processed her words. The tension in the air was palpable, like a charged wire between them. Karoline knew exactly what Malloy was feeling: resentment, irritation, and a growing sense of his own vulnerability. He wasn't used to being challenged, not by someone like her. Without a word, Malloy stepped closer, physically blocking her from entering the courtroom. "Back up," he commanded, his voice cold and biting. "You're not going in." Her pulse quickened, but Karoline didn't budge. She had faced worse in her life. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her now. "I didn't come here to beg," she said sharply, her voice now matching his cold tone. "I came to testify, and that's exactly what I intend to do." The air in the hallway felt thick, almost suffocating. Every breath Karoline took seemed to echo in the quiet space between her and Officer Malloy. He stood before her, unyielding, his arms crossed tightly, his expression hardening with every word she spoke. The stillness in the hallway seemed to mirror the tension building between them, as though the courthouse itself had paused to watch this standoff. Karoline remained tall and composed, the folder she clutched in her hand steady, even as her pulse raced. This wasn't just about entering a courtroom. This was about something much bigger, about respect, authority, and the kind of prejudice that lurked beneath the surface of every interaction. Officer Malloy had just crossed a line, and she wasn't going to let him control her narrative. Not today. "Look," Malloy's voice dropped, now laced with something darker, more sinister. "I don't know who you think you're dealing with, but you're not getting in there without following procedure. We don't just let anyone waltz through these halls without checks and balances." Karoline's jaw tightened. She could feel the chill in his words, meant to belittle her, to make her question her right to even be there. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Not now. Officer Malloy," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have every right to be here. These documents are legal, crucial for the case. I'm here to deliver them and testify. No one asked me to be questioned or harassed on my way in." Malloy scoffed, taking a step closer, his eyes narrowing. Karoline's chest tightened, but she stood her ground. The officer's presence felt suffocating, but her defiance cut through it like a blade. "You think because you got a badge, you could do whatever you want?" she snapped, her voice sharp, challenging. "Well, this isn't your courtroom. This isn't your case." Malloy leaned in, his breath hot against her face, his tone now a sharp contrast to her calm resolve. "I'm just doing my job," he said, the words venomous. "And right now, my job is making sure you don't disrupt the order of things. I don't care who you are or who you think you are. You're not getting past me." He gestured dismissively toward the hallway, where a few bystanders sat on the benches, their eyes flicking nervously between Karoline and the officer. Murmurs rippled through the air, but no one spoke out. The weight of the silence pressed in on Karoline as she felt the eyes of the crowd on her, but she refused to be intimidated. She had faced worse in her life. People like Malloy who believed their badge gave them the right to dictate the rules. But Karoline wasn't just anyone. She had learned to fight against injustice, no matter where it came from. "I'm not here to make trouble," she said softly, her voice a quiet thunder, filled with quiet resolve. "But I will not be made to feel less than. I've done nothing wrong. You are blocking justice now, and that's where I draw the line." Malloy's eyes flickered for a brief moment, the surprise clear on his face. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground like this. He thought she would fold under his gaze, let his authority intimidate her. But she hadn't, and that unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. With a sharp exhale, Malloy took a step back, but not before offering her one last sneer. "Fine, go ahead. But don't think this is over," he warned, his voice low, menacing. Karoline didn't flinch as she walked past him, her footsteps echoing through the hallway like a slow, steady drumbeat. Calm, resolved. She wasn't here to win, not in the traditional sense. This was about something more important, about maintaining her dignity in the face of oppression. As she moved forward, she could still feel the eyes of the people in the hallway on her, their silent judgment weighing heavy. Some had witnessed the confrontation, some hadn't. But Karoline knew. She had made a stand. And though Officer Malloy might think this moment was over, in truth, it was only just beginning. As Karoline stepped into the courtroom, the weight of the moment hit her like a wave. The door shut behind her with a soft thud, sealing her inside the charged atmosphere. Her pulse remained steady, but her body still buzzed with the heat of the confrontation outside. The air in the room felt heavier, as if the energy had shifted the moment she walked in. Every breath she took seemed deliberate, filled with a quiet purpose. She could almost feel the temperature rise, like the room itself was bracing for what was to come. Her eyes scanned the space briefly, before locking onto the judge, who was flipping through the case files, oblivious to the tension she carried with her. But Karoline didn't focus on him or the courtroom itself. Her thoughts were fixed on one thing: ensuring her voice would be heard, that her stand would not be in vain. The moment she came into view, she felt the weight of every eye in the room turn toward her. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Some were curious, others judgmental, and a few simply watched with quiet resignation. None of them knew what had just happened outside these walls. None of them knew how she had been blocked, how she'd been treated like an intruder, a criminal, simply because she was there to deliver justice. Her body still hummed with the tension from the earlier confrontation, but she didn't let it show. She kept her posture unbent, despite the pit in her stomach that twisted with the intensity of the moment. With steady hands, she placed the folder on the clerk's desk with quiet grace. Her fingers betrayed a slight tremor, but she didn't let it break her calm. She didn't look at Officer Malloy, who had followed her into the room. Instead, her gaze shifted to the judge, whose face remained unreadable. The silence in the courtroom felt like a weight pressing down on her, but it was a kind of stillness that made every word, every movement, feel magnified. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Karoline's voice rang out, cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried with it a quiet strength. More than just a voice, it was the sound of someone standing firm, unyielding in their purpose. "I'm here to testify in the case of Marcus Hale, and I'm prepared to present evidence that could turn the tide of this trial." For a moment, the room held its breath again. Karoline could feel the shift in the air, a subtle change. The whispers died down. Even the judge, who had been flipping through his notes, hesitated for just a beat. "Proceed," the judge said, his voice formal, his tone devoid of warmth. His indifference was unmistakable, but Karoline didn't need his approval. She wasn't here for recognition. She was here to make sure the truth was heard, no matter how quiet it had to be. The truth didn't need to shout. It spoke through the quiet dignity of someone who had been silenced for too long. As she took a deep breath, preparing to speak, Karoline caught the eye of another witness, an older man sitting in the front row. His hands were clasped in front of him, and when their gazes met, he gave a subtle nod. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. He had seen what had happened. He knew, and in that moment, Karoline realized the fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been pushed down, ignored, or silenced. It was about standing up for something larger than herself, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Officer Malloy had quietly moved to the back of the room. His eyes were fixed on Karoline now, a mixture of contempt and wariness in his gaze. His stance had shifted, no longer the aggressive figure from earlier, but someone uneasy, uncertain. The change in the dynamic was clear. Malloy had expected her to fold, to cower. But Karoline had stood tall, and that unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. In that moment, Karoline knew she had already won, not through loud protests or anger, but through her defiance, her refusal to back down. Her quiet strength had been louder than any shout. The courtroom had become a stage, and Karoline was no longer a passive observer. She was an agent of change, whether anyone else realized it or not. As she began to recount the details of Marcus Hale's case, her voice remained steady, unwavering. She didn't focus on Malloy, or the judge, or anyone else in the room. She focused only on the truth, letting it fill the space around her. Her words weren't just for the court. They were for everyone who had ever been unjustly silenced, for everyone who had been told to stay in their place. With every word, Karoline could feel the energy in the room shift. It wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. A few people in the back exchanged glances. Others leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. The once passive audience now seemed to hang on her every word, the truth cutting through their doubts, reaching them in a way they hadn't expected. Malloy stood at the back, arms crossed once more, but his posture had changed. The arrogance that had once radiated from him had faded, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, unease. Karoline could see it in his eyes, and though she wasn't sure, she didn't care. The battle had already been won in that room. She had proven that she would not be intimidated, not by the badge, not by the system, and certainly not by him. The tension in the courtroom was thick, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Karoline's calm had shifted into something unshakable, quiet, yet forceful. Officer Malloy lingered at the back, his eyes narrowing in a way that made it clear the battle wasn't over. He hadn't expected her to stand so tall, to challenge him like this. He wasn't prepared for the ripple effect she had set off in the room. But Malloy wasn't one to back down. As Karoline wrapped up her testimony, a ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The atmosphere had shifted, something heavier now, more charged. People were watching, really watching for the first time. Whispers fluttered in the air, and others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The room could feel it. Karoline could feel the weight of their eyes, but she refused to let it derail her. This was the moment. This was where everything could change, where every injustice that had been overlooked would finally be acknowledged. Your Honor, Malloy's voice cut through the room like a cold knife. I'd like to call attention to the actions of the witness. Her conduct outside this courtroom was disruptive, and her attitude. Karoline didn't flinch. She'd seen this before, the desperate attempt to twist the narrative, to shift the blame. But she wouldn't let it happen. She had already made her stand, and she wasn't about to back down now. With one smooth motion, Karoline rose from her seat, her voice firm as she turned to face Malloy head-on. No, Officer Malloy, she interrupted, her words sharp, cutting through his attempt to control the room. What you did outside this courtroom was the disruption. What you tried to do, what you try to make me believe, is the real injustice. A profound silence followed. The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder, vibrating through the room. Even Malloy seemed taken aback for a moment, his expression faltering before he quickly masked it with his usual demeanor. His posture stiffened, the veneer of authority he had carefully built beginning to crack. Is that so? Malloy sneered, but the sarcasm in his voice was thinner now, less sure of itself. You think you can stand here and question my actions? You think your testimony will erase everything I did? Karoline's eyes locked onto his with unwavering strength. I'm not here to erase anything. I'm here to make sure the truth is heard. I'm here to stand up for what's right, even if no one else will. Her voice was steady, every word charged with quiet power. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Malloy didn't speak. The judge didn't speak. The room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the stillness, as Karoline stood there, unflinching in the face of the officer who had already shown his willingness to bully and intimidate. Frustration rippled through Malloy as he took a step forward, his chest rising with each breath, his jaw clenched tight. He tried to maintain his control, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a crack in the armor he'd so carefully built. He had expected Karoline to crumble. Instead, he found himself questioning his own position. Your Honor, Malloy muttered, his voice barely contained. I request that this woman be removed from the courtroom. She is obstructing justice by... But before he could finish, the judge, to Karoline's surprise, interrupted him. His voice was stern but clear, and for the first time, there was no cold detachment in it. Officer Malloy, this is a courtroom, and here, we stand by the truth, not the badge. You will sit down, and you will allow the witness to finish her testimony. The words hit Malloy like a blow, knocking the air from his lungs. For a split second, he looked like he might argue, but the judge's sharp gaze silenced him. His frustration flickered across his face, and for the first time, the mask of authority slipped. Malloy swallowed hard, his broad shoulders slumping ever so slightly, his fists unclenching as he took a reluctant step back. The room was silent for a heartbeat. Karoline exhaled deeply, the adrenaline from the confrontation still humming through her veins, but now the rhythm was different. It wasn't fear. It wasn't frustration. It was the steady beat of someone who had fought, and for the first time felt the scales tipping in her favor. For a moment, the air in the room felt heavy with anticipation. People shifted in their seats, as though they, too, had just witnessed something monumental. The tension remained, but this time, it wasn't hostile. It was charged with possibility. Karoline had turned the tide, And now, everyone was watching, waiting to see how it would play out. The courtroom was still, the air thick with an unsettled silence. Karoline sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart still racing from the standoff. Malloy had been forced to step back, but the weight of his actions lingered, palpable and unsettling. The silence stretched on, a stark reminder of how easily power could be abused and ignored. As the judge took a moment to compose himself, Karoline allowed herself a brief exhale. She had stood firm, and though the battle was far from over, she had made her point. The shift in the room's energy was undeniable. People were watching her now, some with judgment, others with respect. It wasn't just her testimony that had made an impact. It was the quiet defiance, the refusal to accept a system that had allowed people like Malloy to operate unchecked. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We will continue with the proceedings," he said, his tone now more neutral than before. "The witness will be allowed to testify fully. Officer Malloy, you will remain silent." It was a simple command, but its effect was immediate. Malloy didn't speak. He didn't dare challenge the decision. His posture remained rigid, but his earlier bravado had evaporated. The power dynamic had shifted. The weight of the courtroom now rested squarely on Karoline's shoulders. As the proceedings continued, Karoline stood once more, this time with an unshaken calm. The folder in her hands was her weapon, a quiet one, but the truth she carried was louder than any voice could ever be. Her presence felt heavier now, a force of nature, solidifying her place in this battle. She resumed her testimony, but the room was no longer just listening to her words. They were feeling the full weight of her presence. The courtroom had transformed. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a symbol of resistance, a turning point that few would forget. Malloy, now subdued, remained in the background, his eyes flicking between Karoline and the judge. He had lost, not through force or loud declarations, but through quiet dignity. In this silence, Karoline had won, not with anger or confrontation, but with the unyielding power of truth. She hadn't needed to shout. Her stand, her refusal to be intimidated, had spoken volumes. When the session finally adjourned, Karoline stepped out of the courtroom with a deep sense of resolution. The world outside still seemed indifferent, but inside her, there was a quiet satisfaction. She had fought for something much larger than herself, and in doing so, she had ensured that the truth would be heard. As she walked down the courthouse steps, her mind lingered on the faces she'd seen in the room, on the moments when the silence had stretched, thick with tension. The crowd outside had grown, but they weren't just bystanders anymore. There was something different in the air. The murmurs were louder now, not of disbelief or fear, but of understanding. People were beginning to talk, not just about her testimony, but about the system that had allowed Malloy's behavior to go unchecked for so long. Her steps slowed as she reached the bottom of the stairs. The streets felt quieter, almost reverent, as if the city itself had paused to reflect on what had just transpired. Karoline didn't look back at the courthouse, but she felt its weight behind her, pressing down with a sense of finality. For a moment, she stood still, watching the world move around her. She could feel the subtle shift in the energy, nothing loud, nothing immediate, but it was real. A ripple had started, and in that silence, she could sense the beginning of something much larger. Karoline hadn't just fought for herself today. She had fought for every voice silenced by authority. And now, the world around her was beginning to listen. As she turned and walked away, the soft hum of conversation behind her grew louder. It was different now. The people were no longer just watching. They were speaking out. They were questioning. They were listening. And in that moment, Karoline knew that the shift had begun. Her story would not be forgotten. Not today. Not ever. As the courtroom doors closed behind her, Karoline took a deep breath. The journey wasn't over. But in that quiet, unspoken victory, she knew she had made her mark. Her story would be remembered.